We were talking yesterday about the federal government making it easier for refugees to get permanent residency in Australia. They're going to give great certainty to nearly 20,000 people who have been in complete limbo.
The reports today are indicating that the government is preparing to make a decision around its treatment of temporary protection visas or temporary migrants, or refugees in this case. And so, yeah, very excited to see what the government's going to actually do.
So that was yesterday's good news. And this morning there's more Christmas cheer from the Immigration Department. This time for Kiwis. There are hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders living in Australia, and they face all kinds of hurdles to getting permanent residency. They face all kinds of restrictions on what benefits they can access in Australia. And it looks like that is going to be fast-tracked, and Kiwis who are here are going to have a much easier time. Joanne Cox is the chair of the Oz Kiwi Association, who campaigns for fair treatment of Kiwis living in Australia. G'day, Joanne.
Hello. Good morning.
What's happening? Is this a little Christmas gift for you guys?
Well, it certainly is for about 12,000 Kiwis who are waiting for their 189 permanent visa to be approved. So some people who've been waiting for between 12 and 24 months will get their application finally processed, and the new Labor government has promised to process all 12,000 that are on hand by ANZAC Day next year.
And what does that mean? What's a 189? Does that mean permanent residency?
So, yes, it's a permanent visa. There's a New Zealand Stream 189, and then there's a points tested 189 for other nationals, but it's a pathway for New Zealanders to get permanent residency because the special category visa they reside on that allows them to live and work in Australia doesn't have a pathway to permanent residence or citizenship.
And what does permanent residency and citizenship give you that simply living here as a New Zealander doesn't?
A lot of things are the right to vote in the state and federal elections, the right to work in the federal government, access or entry into the ADF, access to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is one thing that really irks New Zealanders because they pay the NDIS levy as part of their Medicare levy with their taxes, but are the only group that pay that levy but can't access the scheme until they become a permanent resident or citizen.
I see. So New Zealanders are entitled to live in Australia, entitled to get Medicare benefits, but not entitled to get the NDIS.
Correct.
Was that a specific carve-out when the NDIS was created?
Well, the official term is that it was an oversight. Perhaps it was an oversight back when the scheme was first developed, but the fallout from that has been quite serious, and it's one of the things that because Kiwis can, as Australians, and go to New Zealand, they just get off a plane, start working and live their lives. But Australians, after residing in New Zealand for 5 years, can just pay $500 and become a citizen. After a year, they can vote in the council and national elections. 2 years, they can get student loans. 3 years, they can access social security and public housing, etc. And then 5 years of residency, they become a citizen.
Wow. For
Kiwis in Australia, they don't get that. They haven't had that since 2001 when the Howard government changed the special category visa that New Zealanders are automatically granted to effectively a temporary visa that has no pathway to citizenship.
And Joanne, this is one of those issues, isn't it, where Aussies are completely oblivious to just what a friction this causes across the ditch, where, you know, this imbalance between the way that Australia treats New Zealanders and the way that New Zealand treats Australians is really sticks in the craw. My mum's a Kiwi, so every time I'm over there, it just seems to get worse and worse. And now with that whole, when the Morrison government basically introduced this rule that New Zealanders who have a criminal record in Australia are going to be deported back to New Zealand. So, you know, then talk radio lit up all across New Zealand saying that, you know, there were people who might have been born in New Zealand, they might have come to Australia when they were 2 months old, they've spent all their lives in Australia, they commit a crime, and all of a sudden they have to be sent to this country that they have functionally no connection to, New Zealand, and that, like, the sort of betrayal of the ANZAC spirit that represented felt like the final stage in a series of indignities that Australia has committed against Kiwis.
Correct. And I'll just go back to your point where your mother is a New Zealander, because it very much affects Australian citizens as well because of we call blended families. When you've got one parent as Australian, one as a New Zealander, and the disparity that that causes, the Australian citizen would have to sponsor their New Zealand partner for a permanent visa through a partner sponsor visa, which costs $8,000. That's one example of that.
Right.
And the children in that family would be Australian citizens through the parent who's Australian. But say if it's the mother who's a New Zealander and the marriage breaks down or there's violence, etc., and they have to go into a refuge, most refugees can't support a New Zealander because if they're funded by the government, they receive federal government funding, they simply cannot help non-citizens and in many cases permanent residents. So those New Zealanders with Australian citizen children are very much badly affected by the issues that the temporary special category visa has created. But to go to the deportation factor, that is very much a Duff and Morrison thing. They just clamp down on minor offending, really. I mean, people are being deported for what Australian citizens would consider minor offences, shoplifting, selling cannabis. I mean, there are serious violent offenders and sexual offenders, etc., that deserve being deported. They also removed the 10-year protective rule that once someone's resided in Australia, and it's the rule of thumb around the world, that if you've resided in a country for 10 years, you're effectively naturalised and you wouldn't normally be considered for deportation unless you committed a serious violent or sexual crime such as rape or murder, and considered a danger to the society. And many of the people that we've dealt with since that Section 501 rule change in December 2014 are very much in the minor offending category, because Dutton changed the 501 law to be retrospective, cumulative sentencing would be considered, including juvenile offending, and juvenile offending is usually a closed shop. They don't usually consider that at all. And we've had people who were had juvenile convictions who've lived in Australia for decades. Once that rule change came in the beginning of 2015, effectively, we've had people picked up because of that juvenile offending, because they've declared their juvenile offending, and it's not been a problem before, but once it changed for 12 months, cumulative retrospective offending, it's pretty much, open book.
Yeah,
people
and
just
Joanne,
get sent home for ridiculously.
I think if Australians actually understood the depth of hurt and the ubiquity of kind of anger about this on the streets of New Zealand, then they would just overturn the rules, and they'd create parity between the way that New Zealand treats Aussie migrants and Australia treats Kiwi migrants. But at least, Merry Christmas, this is good news in one respect. So by ANZAC Day, all of those outstanding applications from New Zealanders in Australia to have permanent residency, how apt that it is ANZAC Day, will be processed. Joanne, thanks for explaining it to us.
Sure.
Merry Chrissy.
They really are Australia's problem and not New Zealand's, but they've become.
Yep. Yeah, Joanne. That's Joanne Cox, who's the chair of the Oz Kiwi Association. Sorry about the way that ended. I'm not quite sure what happened there. She campaigns for the fair treatment of New Zealanders living in Australia.